Okay, one thing. I have posted both the presentation assignment and the schedule for your presentations. So just to go over that briefly, the presentation, of course, is going to just be over your guys' term paper. And so I will expect it to be 10 to 15 minutes in length. So if you go under 10 minutes, you'll lose points. But if you go over 10 minutes, I'll just cut you off. Or sorry, if you go over 15 minutes, I'll just cut you off. Now you won't lose any points. It's actually really normal. So has anyone ever been to a conference yet? Professional conference? That people in professional conferences, you know, they have 20 minutes to speak usually, and they almost always get cut off. So I'm not gonna like narc you down if you go over, but I will mark you down if you go under. Make sure to include all the major ideas that you talk about in your paper. What I'm really looking for, what your goal should be, is you should have a clear, you should basically display your findings in a clear and concise manner, right? So one is I'm looking for you actually taking the content of your paper and explaining it to people. Writing and speaking are very different things, right? So what is clear on a page is usually not very clear when you speak. So, you know, try to present things in an approachable way that people can understand, but hit all of your major ideas, even the more complicated ones. And I also want you to be engaging with your fellow students, right? Your goal should be to elicit questions and reactions from them. So what I don't want to see, and you will lose points if you do this, what I don't want to see is you standing up here, you know, talking about your project, right? Which a lot of people do. So like, make sure that you're actually like engaging with people. You know, to some degree, like you picked topics because you were interested in them, right? So like, just allow your enthusiasm for that topic to be what it is, right? Like, don't be afraid to stand up here and show that you're actually really interested in what you looked into. Okay, other things, barring extenuating circumstances, you must be present. So if you're sick, obviously, we don't want people coming when they're sick. If you're quarantined, obviously you can't come if you're quarantined. But otherwise, I want you to be here. Each time you're here, and I don't know why, you'll lose 10% of your presentation grade. So that's 5 points each time you miss. And the reason why I do that is because otherwise it would just be me and the people presenting that day and nobody else in class, which is going to make it a lot harder for people to present, and it'll be less of a positive experience. So yeah, you will be marked down 10% unless you have a valid reason not to be here. Lastly, no makeups. So to pull off presentations, you have to kind of make sure that people are, you know, actually coming on the days that they're assigned. Otherwise, we're going to end up with 15 presentations the last day, right? And everybody's only going to talk for 2 minutes. And then that's not really going to be a very good experience, like pedagogical experience for people. It's not going to actually teach you, you know, how to speak in front of groups. So once again, like there are extenuating circumstances, but for the most part, I expect you to be here on the day you're assigned. You can trade with people. So you can trade slots, just sort of like if you guys were working a job, right, and you had to be there at certain time slots, you trade off with each other. You can do that, but I'm not going to manage it. So you have to, one, if you're going to trade times with somebody, trust them enough to actually show up on the day that you've traded them for. But two, like, yeah, you'll be the one who has to do that. If you are one of our remote people, so that's specifically you watching at home, or if you end up on quarantine between now and then, or whatever, right, and you're not sick, you can present via Blackboard Collaborate. So we will run that in the classroom, and you can just present. On Blackboard Collaborate, you might want to play around with it in advance. You can show your own screen. right? So like it's very good for doing actually PowerPoint presentation kind of stuff. So yeah, so you should think about doing Blackboard Collaborate if you cannot make it. Other notes, other requirements. You may either utilize PowerPoint presentation, or you may just prepare a sort of like speech or statement in advance. Depending on what discipline you're in, different things are usually considered appropriate at a conference. And in some disciplines, my own, like there's actually a gamut of things people will do. So some people will present their findings via PowerPoint. I usually like to do PowerPoint slides with images and no words. You know, sometimes people will do very different things. Sometimes people, prepare a speech. Sometimes people read a redacted version of their own essay aloud. That's the hardest to pull off. It sounds the easiest. So being engaging while reading a paper aloud is really difficult. So I don't necessarily recommend it, but you can do it. In terms of, and I always just get this question, like, can you use note cards? Yeah, you can use anything you want. At least in, like, if you're a sociologist, you know, people bring in notebooks, people bring in note cards, people bring in loose sheets of paper. I like to write my presentation on legal sheets because the papers are really long and I don't have to flip it as often. You know, so yeah, it's, one thing I don't want to see though, is that if you're doing a PowerPoint, don't read off the PowerPoint. That is the most dull thing ever, right? Like, I remember in undergrad, I had professors that would do that. Do you guys ever have professors that literally just read word for word their PowerPoint? This is the most boring thing ever, right? Like, you can read, you're not 5, it's already up there. So what I don't want to see anybody do is have like really long paragraphs on a PowerPoint and then stand there and troll on reading their PowerPoint aloud. Don't read your PowerPoint. You will be marked down if you do it. And just to reiterate, you must be engaging. At the end of your presentation, include any valid citations. So, any questions about presentations? And, yeah.
So you said like people ask us questions afterwards. If we can't like answer the question, we get like points marked off or like
Well, it's good. You won't get marked. I won't mark. Yeah. One thing is keep in mind, I'm not a speech teacher. So in the same way that I say like I'm not an English teacher, I'm not going to grade you on the basis of your use of grammar, right? Same thing kind of goes for this. So yeah, if you can't answer your questions, but generally speaking, like if you're the speaker, you have the power in the room. So like you can always answer questions even if it's with a non-answer. So if somebody asks you a question you don't know, you'd be like, oh, I haven't looked into that yet. Or whatever, right? Like presenters do that all the time. So like I don't expect you to know everything in the world about your topic. Usually try your best to come up with an educated guess or an interpretation that you can say something. But if you can't, you just say that you haven't really looked into it and you will. Or you should, or you say none of the sources I looked at talked about that, but that would be really interesting if, right? So like, there's dodgy ways of answering questions without answering them. Not that you won't get marked down. Also, like I will not mark you down for saying or like shifting your weight from one point, putting your hands in your pocket, pacing, right? All those things are actually professional in my discipline. Like nobody's like, if it's more like in business speaking, or if you're a politician that you're not supposed to do those things. For those of you, like some of you are going to be school teachers and some of you are going to be cops or criminologists, some of you are going to be sociologists. In all those disciplines, that kind of precision isn't expected. So it's more important that you convey information well and that you're enthusiastic than that you avoid those little things. Yeah, other questions? I also want to say I used to be really afraid of public speaking myself. So like, I know like how many people in here are afraid of public speaking? Is there anybody? Of course, asking people to hold their hands up. Yeah, so like that's very common. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to do a bad job. Like in a lot of ways, the whole reason I do presentations in most of my classes is simply because it's really important that you get used to doing it. It's the only way to get over it. It's just to do it over and over again. Especially like, you know, going back to like, I'm not grading you like a speech teacher would, so you shouldn't have nerves about that. So just kind of like show up and try to acclimate to standing in front of people, right? Because that's really kind of the whole point. And you're probably going to have to talk publicly regardless of what you do for a living. Obviously those of you who are going to be teachers are going to stand in front of people all the time. What kind of killed being afraid of public speaking for me was teaching classrooms of over 100 people. Because you just have to show up like twice a week and stand up in front of 100 people and talk. And really, like, if you're talking with teaching for 100 people, you don't get to sit in a chair and have a discussion, right? Like, you have to talk for an hour to 100 people. Horribly uncomfortable if you're afraid of public speaking, but like you do that for a few years and it kind of takes away your nerves. I still get nervous though. I'll get nervous randomly before class sometimes. Anyways. Any questions about, other questions about presentations? Do you guys want to see when you're going to present? These are also both up on Blackboard, so I'll hold that for a second so people can write it down if their name is already on it. There's a few people not included in that list. Let's scroll down. Everyone get down? Everybody who wasn't shown, I guess, was not here. So. Cool. You guys got the email about the change and what the reading is? I don't expect you to do a discussion for it since I didn't have it up over the weekend. I don't know what was going on with the scanner, but it sent all the documents I scanned at like noon, like at like 11:30 at night. So when I opened my email this morning, it was there. I was like, oh, why did that happen? This is just weird. Anyways, so the difference between the readings is simply that like the reading that we have focuses on one person who's a psychoanalytic race person, who is actually probably the most important one to know, which is Franz Fanon. Franz Fanon is a very famous theorist of race from the early 20th century, 1950s. So we'll look at more at like what psychoanalytic thought does with race on Thursday. So. Okay. So we left off talking about Collins, right? So we're on the last thing that we're really going to talk about in depth, which is this standpoint epistemology. So take a look at your notes and tell me where we're at. Tell me what we were talking about. One of the more philosophical class periods of the semester. What is epistemology? Let's start there.
I think we said it was like what we think is true based on our like social structure or something like that.
So that's definitely going to be like where she's going to take us. But we'll just start with the word.
what does epistemology mean? Yeah.
How do we know?
Yeah, it's the question of how do we know what we know? Like, what are the rules we follow for knowing? That's the question of epistemology. What serves as the basis of knowledge? Right? Did anybody write down or remember the other major question in philosophy?
Ontology?
Ontology. And what is ontology?
What is?
Yeah, it's the study of what is, right? So another way to think about it is when we can make empirical claims, X, Y, and Z is what's out there, or we can make epistemological claims. This is what people know, this is how we know what we know. Also things that would be included in epistemological claims would be things like, what is it that people think, right? It's important to like delineate and understand which is being talked about, right? So like you can think about a lot of the things that we've talked about in this class are actually epistemology rather than ontology, right? Things like, what is it that people thought about race? What is the thought world that surrounds race is an epistemological question, right? Post-colonialism, which we're going to look at later, right, is all about, the studies in post-colonial studies are all about the epistemology of race, right? What is it that people say and think about race? Or even when we started really early on talking about the birth of the idea of race, right? That's an epistemological question. So, but part of epistemology is that sort of like, how do you know, right? So if you just want to think about it, epistemology involves thoughts, right? Ontology involves things, objective reality. Don't get that confused with it being subjective versus objective, right? So like epistemology isn't something subjective. It's not what I feel, what I think, right? Epistemology is collective. How do we know collectively something, right? What's the predominant form of epistemology? The one that Collins critiques? Which form of epistemology is Collins critical of? Starts with a P.
Post-positivist.
Well, she is a post-positivist. So, what other one starts with a P? We can get into what post-positivism is. I'll give you a word. A clue, you just knock the word post off. Positivism. What was positivism? To understand what post-positivism is, you got to understand what positivism is. Yeah.
There's a worldview that like favored natural science and objectivism.
Yeah, it's a belief system, and yeah, that's a good way to put it. Objectivism. So, what do we mean by that? What's important within an objectivist worldview? What are you supposed to always remove? Bias. What's another way to put removing bias? What are you removing from your study? Yourself. Right? So the person making the claim, what they think, what they feel, what they do, isn't supposed to matter. You're supposed to bracket all of those things out. Right? And this is really kind of like where we slip into, can you do that? Can you really remove yourself from the things that you study? Can you just decide to not be biased? You can't. And the reason you can't is because basically, like, here's the trick about bias is if you have it, you probably don't know that you have it. Right? So most of the things that we're biased about, right, they're not like, there is a, like, you can try not to be purposely biased, right? But you can't remove yourself from the equation, right? And there's a lot of, basically, like, philosophy of science has really changed in the 20th century insofar as people don't really believe that you can do that anymore, right? That's become something that's highly doubted, even in scientific circles. And the reason why is because, and anyone in here, who are my people that are in in methods. So you guys are, Isaac's taken it before, right? So like if you're taking methodology courses, right, at the end of your study, the thing that you always still have to do is interpret, right? Data in and of itself is meaningless. It always has to be interpreted. It's in that moment, right, where you have to actually bring yourself back in. So to make sense of information, to make sense of the observations that you have, you always have to be present in it, right? Otherwise it becomes meaningless. So this becomes a lot of doubt whether positivism can exist. The doubts around positivism is something called post-positivism. And this is an example of post-positivism. So, do you guys remember what standpoint epistemology was? Did you guys have any notes on that in your...
How people decide what's true and what's not true based on societal structures that surround them.
Yeah, so the idea is that, so the idea of standpoint epistemology, which is something that grows mostly out of feminism, is the idea that where you occupy in social structure, right? We could think about this in terms of Collins, right? Like where you fall in that matrix of domination, right, is going to largely determine what biases you bring to the table when you do a study, right? So your experience of social reality has a lot to do with the opinions you hold, the philosophies you have, right? And so like really like rather than there being like one way of knowing, i.e. objective positivism, right? Essentially what Collins is going to argue for is that there are other epistemologies which are equally valid, right? Which take into consideration other things. Now, anytime you start talking about post-positivism, people want to immediately jump to relativism. Do you think that Collins is a relativist from everything else we've read? Does Collins seem to not care what people think about the world, whatever opinion you have, fine? Is that the feeling you get from reading Collins? No, Collins has some very definitive opinions, right, about, in particular, things like inequality, right? So it's not I think this is a good example of like, you don't get from Collins that she's some sort of relativist. And in fact, most people who deny objective positivism, you're not going to get that from them. So we often talk about it like in this sort of like hippie-ish, like anything goes way. But I don't think you're seeing that, right? Like instead she has very decided opinions. And to some degree, one of her decided opinions is that objective positivism is not necessarily the best way of knowing. Because it essentially allows people, particularly people, who dominates academia? What makes you, what is, if we could put it like, what populations do you think are probably most important for constructing knowledge? Whose voices do we listen to the most?
Like white middle-aged men.
White middle-aged men, right? Where do those white middle-aged men have a tendency to live? Where are they from? Most of your scientists, most of your humanities people, where are these people from in the world? Are most of them from South America? Are most of them from Africa? Most of them from Southeast Asia? The Arctic?
United States.
They're from the United States or Europe, right? So you're talking about white middle-aged men from Europe. What social class do you think they're mostly from? Particularly oh, sorry, I'll just ask a question. What social class do you think they're mostly from?
Like middle to upper.
Yeah, middle to upper. And in fact, like if you were to like stack scientists by like their impact, the higher up you go, probably the more impact you actually have on your discipline, right? So you're talking about mostly upper middle class people to middle class people, right? You get some people who are upwardly mobile, constructing knowledge. Which, like, you can totally feel that if it's not just as sort of like an aside. Like, I'm kind of like lower working class is kind of like my background. Rural lower working class, and you can totally feel when you show up in graduate school, if you're from lower working class background, you can totally feel that you have less capital than everybody the second you walk into the room, right? As in, like, capital is sort of a catch-all term sociologists use to mean like that you like the right things that are popular at the right time, that you dress in the right clothing. Like, you can definitely feel that there's a divide, right? How your world works. That inevitably that has to be overcome by anybody, and Collins kind of speaks to that throughout the book, right? That it kind of has to be overcome by anybody who goes into that. So you're talking about a very narrow set of people who generally construct knowledge. Do what they view as the rules for constructing knowledge generally held by everybody else in the world? As in, like, does everyone agree about what is really out there? How do you construct knowledge of it? No. And so what she's bringing out here is one particular way of validating knowledge that comes out of her own community, right? So she's looking at how is it, rather than objective positivism, how is it that particularly working class and below African American women think about knowledge, right? How is it that they think about claims that people make as being valid or not valid? And I think you'll also see when we go through this, like, there's some things that are shared across different, like, races and class groups, but as you move out of the dominant group, right, certain ways of knowing are considered valuable, right, that often within academia itself are thought of as not, right? So it's this tension, right? So does our epistemology, does the way in which in, sort of academic circles we think about validating knowledge, is this more of a reflection of privilege than it is a reflection of how people best know, right? Okay, so starting on page 275, we get the different types of knowledge, right? That she's going to, the different ways that African American women validate knowledge. So just looking at the subheadings, I think we can kind of get back into this. So what is the subheading here on page 275? It's an easy question. It's just the subheading. Yeah.
What is experience as a criterion of meaning?
Okay, so what does that mean? What do you think that means? Lived experience as a criterion of meaning. Within the discussion we just had, what validates people's experience? Just from the title. Whose opinions should you trust?
Those who have lived the experience?
Yeah. So basically, like, is experience an important part of objectivist epistemology? So positivist epistemology, is experience an important part of it? No, in fact, experience makes you suspect, right? So the idea is like, if you want somebody who really knows, they should be somebody who hasn't experienced X, Y, and Z, right? So in a flipped sort of way, African American women have a tendency to only trust sources who experience it in real life. Right? Could we think of an example of this in terms of Collins? Some of the discussions. What sort of things does she like to talk about? What sort of objective phenomenon does she like to talk about? what topics have we talked about in the class so far when we've read this book? Just any of them. Yeah.
The different types of like black females in slavery and how they were treated. Like some were house, like they took care of the house and the kids, and some didn't.
Yeah, so she's talked a lot about how people, there was that one history that she read, right? She talked a lot about how the different experiences that black women have, right, over the course of time. Whose voices did she want to listen to hear that? To figure out what happened?
The ones who lived it, like.
Yeah, she wants to hear the voice, whenever voices pop up of people who lived in slavery, if she wants to understand slavery. How do you see that as not an objectivist point of view? Would you trust that voice in an objectivist epistemology and positivism? Why not? What would go ahead.
Because their experience, according to the objectivist way of research, would say that it's overly influencing their opinion about the topic.
Yeah, can somebody who's a slave be objective about slavery? What do you think? Can they be objective about slavery? Can they remove any bias or feeling they have about that institution? Probably not, right? So objectivist epistemology would say we should doubt, if you hear somebody who is enslaved talk about slavery, we should doubt whether what they're saying is real, right? From a black feminist standpoint epistemology, you would say, no. If you really want to know what slavery as an institution was like, you should essentially ask people who are whipped, hung, etc., as a result and had their loved ones had that done to their loved ones, people who had their children, their families torn apart, right, by slaveholders. Those are really the people you should talk to, right? They're the people with lived experience of slavery. They're the voice that matters, right? What does that have to do? How does that change? So if we were to talk about present inequality, and I think you can see this cutting throughout the book. If we're talking about present inequality, whose voice should we probably try to understand? If we're going to understand what's actually happening in the world. According to this, whose voice we're talking about? So like we could take a tangible example. If we're going to understand homelessness, whose voice should we listen to? Homeless people, right? In the objectivist philosophy, right, homeless people would be suspect if we want to understand homeless people because they have a vested interest in what they're going to say. They're going to be biased, right? From a standpoint epistemology, homeless people are the people who understand what's going on, right, with homelessness. More so than, people in the government, more so than social scientists who want to interview them, right? More so than ... Homeless people are the people who understand homelessness. You guys see how that kind of works? So and just to kind of give an example, what sort of things do people have a tendency to do for homeless people? I'll bring this up anytime. Homeless people come up. What do charities usually do for homeless people? What do they provide for them? Or just if you decided you wanted to help homeless people, what would you do?
Like shelter or
food. Food, you do a shelter, right? Clothing. What do you think it is that homeless people generally don't need? What do you think they probably have enough of? Food and clothing. This is actually the only thing they have. We used to be friends. Have I told this story at all? I tell this story in some of my classes. I became friends when I lived in Richmond with a lot of the homeless people in my neighborhood. Just because, I like to talk to random people, right? Homeless people are always up for a good chat. Really, like, to be honest, like, if you ever see a homeless person on the street and you walk by, like, you should just strike up a conversation with them. Sometimes they're really interesting. Totally different experience of the world, right? So thinking about standpoints is a great example, right? Totally different experience of the world. But like, you know, I used to like, the people that I got to know really well and I trusted, I would do things like let them take a shower at my house when I was home, my apartment, right? So they'd come up to my apartment, I'd buzz them in and they'd take a shower and then they'd go leave, right? One of the things they didn't have access to was showers, something we wouldn't normally think about, right? And most of the time when they would come, they would bring me food to thank me for letting them use the shower. So it's like this sort of irony, right? They're like, oh, I have plenty of food. Or people would do things like, they'd give them a frozen turkey. What the heck is a homeless person going to do with a frozen turkey? Like, you know. So anyways, the point being is that like on one level, we make all sorts of assumptions about people's lives and what they need and what they don't need and what they should or shouldn't have, right? We address it from our standpoint, right? And if we are objective social scientists doing study on homelessness, those things are still going to probably bias what we find, right? And you're going to get a very different view of homelessness if you actually know homeless people. You know, so that's kind of the idea, right? The idea that Collins is saying is like those lived-in experiences are probably more important than whether or not the voice saying them has a vested interest in it, right? For validating knowledge. Okay. It also means that they have a tendency to doubt people with, like, as she puts it in the quote in here, educated fools who have book learning but no mother wit, right? So like there's a doubt about this sort of like removed knower is something that can exist. Which really means I shouldn't be the one talking to you about race, right? It's sort of epistemological, right? That there's an irony, right, to me telling you this. Okay, 279, page 279. So what's our section heading? I gotta fix my mask. It keeps on running down on me. Just holler it out when you hear it. Get to it. Anyone at all? Did you guys catch the page number? Yeah, what's the title? What's the sub?
The use of dialogue in assessing knowledge claims.
Yeah, the use of dialogue. What do you think that means? How do you come to a better understanding in this system?
Through conversation.
Yeah. So like the objectivist knower also is this idea of this sort of like removed person working all on their own, right? And like, you know, sort of like if you think about our image of a scholar, what does a scholar do? i.e., like if you go to my office, what is it that I'm usually doing? Usually sitting around reading books by myself, right? Like I'm not out dialoguing with people, right? I'm sort of a removed observer, right? In the same way, like really it's in those people, it's in this sort of conversation between groups of people, right? That the knowledge is constructed is the claim, right? Which we can think about too, like in terms of talking about, to stick with our example of homelessness, right? Even though that's not specifically a race thing, right? But if we're talking about our example of homelessness, right? If you bring homeless people into a conversation about what they, like you could think about like if we were going to have some get together and figure out what should be done with homeless people, and we don't have too many homeless people in Atchison, but like if we were in Kansas City and you know people who you know worked for nonprofits came together, right? Essentially the idea would be you'd have to bring in other groups of people and dialogue. Right? So for Black feminist scholar, the conversation between people is really important for understanding what's going on. right? Dialogue is different from, so like, dialogue is different from argument. An objectivist worldview is built off of the idea of argument. So, what's the difference between a dialogue and an argument? What do you think? There's an implication to these words. It's very different.
Like a dialogue, you're like listening to the other person and you're kind of like trying to find knowledge, but like an argument, you're just like trying to like say your perspective and not like listening to them.
Well, yeah, totally. So the idea, another way to put it, who wins in a dialogue?
No.
Maybe both people, because their understanding of each other and their point of view.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. Like, there isn't winners and losers in a dialogue. Dialogue is instead people from different perspectives talking things out, figuring things out together. You know, like, if anyone's ever taken a philosophy class, you guys all have to take philosophy classes, right? Like, as part of your job. Did anybody learn about pragmatism? Pragmatism, that's like the way of knowing that pragmatism often promotes, right? This idea of like different people in conversation can come to an intersubjective understanding of the world, right? They can understand the world better together than they can apart, right? So it's that like collaborative work of talking about things, exploring things together that will get us to some sort of knowing, right? Claiming a very similar thing happens in black feminism, right? Or amongst African American women. They're doubtful of people who state their opinions really decidedly and hold to them, right? So yeah, in an argument, like, yeah, it's basically two people. If you think about the structure of journals, right? Or like academic discourse in general, it's often built off of argument. One person will write one thing, be like, this is what I found, and another person will be like, that's not what's there, this is what's there. And they go back and forth, and do usually any of these debates ever get resolved? 100 years later, we're still going to teach them to you, right? You think about most sort of major debates, right? That's kind of how it works. So the idea is dialogue is instead collaboratively coming. We have more of this in academia today than when Collins was writing originally. A lot more people want to work collaboratively. In fact, I used to get harassed if I used the word argument in a paper in graduate school. They're like, unless you're arguing with somebody, you don't have an argument. You know, it's like, when you first learn to write, I don't know if this is still true, when you first learn to write, you do introduction, argument, conclusion. Is it still how you learn when you like learn to write in high school, right? And that's like, one of the things is like, you're only arguing if you have an adversary, right? So if you think about it, the difference between an adversarial way of speaking versus a conversation, a debate versus a conversation. Do debates usually lead to any good conclusion between two people? Has anyone ever seen a debate naturally resolve itself and one person being like, okay, great, you won? No, like usually what happens when people speak adversarially, they argue and then they walk away, both with their original understanding, right? A dialogue is different. A dialogue can be transformative. Right? Okay. Last one, page 281. What's our subheading here? What's our subheading?
The ethics of caring.
Yeah. Did anybody catch what meant basically? And this is almost the dead opposite of an objectivist worldview. What validates people's thoughts about what's going on in the world?
How passionate they are about the topic.
Yeah. Yeah. That the emotions of the person, and so the emotions of the person speaking, right, speaks to whether or not their thoughts are likely to be real, right? So in other words, like if you really care about something, you probably have a better understanding of it than somebody who doesn't. You guys see how opposite of objectivism that is, right? So in a lot of ways, like what objectivism would call bias, right? She's saying should be a qualifier for real knowledge. Real knowledge grows out of a place of concern, right? And we could particularly think about like the place of inequality in her worldview, right? That if I'm concerned with the care of other people, my worldview is probably more accurate about those people than if I couldn't care less whether they live or die, right? Generally speaking, when we talk about the welfare of other people, a lot of the voices we hear speaking are people who do not care about them. And essentially from her perspective, right, those people are voices who you should probably not listen to, right? People who have a vested interest in protecting and taking care of people are actually better voices. You think about like this, there was a lot of like debates in the like late 80s about healthcare workers, in particular how doctors often treated patients versus nurses. So, so who's closer to a patient usually, their doctor or their nurse? The nurse, right? Why is that? What does a nurse do as opposed to a doctor? So you think about like somebody goes in for a surgery. What sort of things does the surgeon do? What does the surgeon do in a surgery? They operate on the person, right? Is this a good moment to sort of get to know the needs of that person? No, not really. Why? They're in anesthesia. They're not even awake probably, right? How does this differ from what a nurse does? What sort of activities do nurses do with their patients?
They'll like take their vitals before surgery, prep them, kind of talk with them how they're feeling and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and then after the surgery, they're the ones who administer their drug treatments. They're the ones who check their IVs. They're the ones who like talk to their families when they call about how somebody's doing. They're the ones who like change their bedpans, change their sheets, give them sponge baths, right? Like, etc., etc., etc. Whose opinion about patients do we usually trust more? Doctors. Even though doctors are further removed from their patients. And actually in the 1980s, what they found is that often nurses had a more accurate understanding of their patients' conditions than their doctors did. So there's this big movement about actually, like, because before like the 1980s, generally nurses were sort of thought of as these sort of like unimportant people you didn't really have to listen to, who were only good for changing bedpans, right? After the 1980s, there was a shift and nurses became somebody you should listen to, right? And to some degree, that's sort of a good example of an ethics of caring, right? Like the nurses in taking care of their patients actually understood them, right? So what validates knowledge is that sort of closeness of caring, right? So it's different than experience. Like one way I could know, one thing that shows that I probably understand the situation could be that I'm the patient, right? Which is also something we generally denied before, right? The patient generally knows how they're feeling better than their doctor does, right? Lived in experience, right? Another way would be the person who actually takes care of that person. Right? In the same way we're going to apply this to other phenomenon, right? if we were to apply this to, our other example of homelessness, same exact thing, right? Like if you're not going to listen to homeless people, who should you listen to? The people who do things for homeless people, right? Somebody in some corner office in the city government is probably not the person you should talk to if you want to understand homeless people, right? Which is actually an inversion of how we normally want to talk about it, right? Okay, so does all that make sense? You guys kind of get the difference between standpoint and epistemology. You can see how that relates to what she was talking about throughout the book. So like her way of understanding race is basically built upon black women's experience of the social structure. If you want to understand the structure of inequality, that matrix of domination, the intersecting of race, class, gender, etc., you have to find the people who that thing imposes upon the most and listen to what they have to say. Right? They're the people who are going to be able to tell you how it works. Right? Which is in a lot of ways where we started. Do you guys remember this master-slave dialectic from Hegel? Right? Who's wiser, the master or the slave? Right? We'd normally want to say the master. In some ways, objectivism wants to say the master. The master is more removed from the situation. Right? What does Collins want to say? Collins wants to say the slave. Okay. All that makes sense? Cool. We have 15 minutes left, right? Or is it 20 minutes? This class that's up at 10 or 15 after? 15 after. Okay, cool. We have enough time to leap into the next one. So take a moment, take a breather, resettle. Slowly get out your article. We're going to start out with the sweetest taboo, studies in Caribbean sexualities. I'm going to give you a moment to look back over it since we were just talking about something else. That was too calming of a voice. I sounded like I was going to be a therapist there for a moment. Or a yoga instructor. I miss yoga. I do. Doing it by yourself in your living room. First of all, I'm way too tall to actually fit in my living room horizontally. Two, it's just not the same. Okay. So the article that we're looking at, this is one. We've already talked a little bit about sex and race, right? But we talked about it specifically in a United States context. This is getting us to think about it in a more colonial context, right? A more global context. Two, has anybody ever read a review essay before? Did anybody notice anything different about this essay versus other essays we've read so far? Other things we've read. What is our author writing about? What serves as its data, if you will, its information? Looks like maybe you have something. Are you onto something? Do you want to make a guess? No? Yeah.
Like other books, like analyzing other books.
Yeah. A review essay just tells you what's in the literature. Does our author have an argument about sexuality in the Caribbean? Not divorce it from what we were just talking about. Are they making some solid statement about about the reality of? Is there a central point to this article at all? No, there isn't, right? This is literally just sort of like, if you want to know what people write about sexuality in the Caribbean, this is what the literature's saying, right? So review essays just give you the lay of the land, right? So first of all, was anybody impressed by just the sheer amount of studies of Caribbean sexuality there are? Anybody notice this? Right? Like, there's a lot out there. Generally, this is the reason why review essays exist. So So generally speaking, like we almost overstudy the world. So if you want to, you know, it's hard to make sense of something like what is the information on Caribbean sexuality without having somebody go through and produce like kind of a laundry list of different things. So the way to read a review essay in a lot of ways is just to go through it and think about what are interesting things that you see. So I think we could probably take this much the same way. And just kind of like, what were anything that jumped out to at people while they read it? If you look back through, find sections. I think I'm going to do this. Did I talk about my Quaker town hall meeting? This is my new thing for teaching. Have you ever seen a Quaker town hall meeting? So in a Quaker town hall meeting, what people do is they, there's nobody in charge. And so what they do is they like might have a reading, but then everyone will just sit there until somebody has something to say. That person will just stand up and they'll say something. And if somebody has a response to that, they'll say something. Otherwise, that person will just sit back down. And they'll just sit until somebody else feels moved to say something, and then they'll stand up and say something. So let's think about doing that, basically. That's how I think I want to address this article. So look through, tell me when you have something that you remember from when you read it that was like, this was interesting, or this was strange, or I didn't really understand this. Does anybody know what the point of it is, right? Okay, I'll be quiet now. We'll see what happens. I did this with freshmen and it worked really well, so I'm going to try it with you guys. I know it's a little awkward to sit in silence. Yeah.
Sure, do it.
What's
Should
that?
I stand up or no?
No, you don't have to stand
Okay.
up. We don't have to do it that officially. Yeah, you don't have to stand up.
I just thought it was interesting how, just the stories about sex workers, I always find it interesting, like, the examples, and so one of them, like, talked about a woman named Elena, and, like, a
Do you have a page number for that?
I do not. I'm sorry.
Oh, no problem. Go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, I could probably find it. It is on page 252.
252. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
But, I don't know, I thought it was interesting that she talked about how, like, a lot of, like, the tourist German or whatever, a German tourist, like, favored her and, like, moved, like, provided so much for her, and then once she had, like, a kid, he, like, was like, this kid is too, like, black for me or something, like, to be my kid, and kind of just left the family. And it's just sad how a lot of the times, like, these women kind of become dependent, like, on specific men that they fall in love with and want to marry and expect that they're going to provide for them the rest of life, but then they end up, you know, getting in a situation where the man leaves them and they end up in a worse position than they do before because they have kids now. And I just, yeah, it's just kind of, it was just sad to me to hear some examples and what women had to go through.
Did anybody else have any thoughts on that? On this, yeah, there's a big section where it talks about women, especially women expecting to be married. Why do people become prostitutes? This kind of sort of gets us into a question. Did anybody notice why people become prostitutes in the Caribbean? Usually? Yeah.
Isn't it like to like provide for their family, whereas here it's like illegal?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's illegal in Jamaica or not. Some of the
No, I'm
things that
saying
they...
like here in the United States.
Yeah. Here in the United States it's illegal. People still do it,
Yeah.
right? It's stigmatized for people in the Caribbean to be prostitutes.
It's like normal.
Yeah, it's fairly normal. Actually, did anybody catch the sheer amount of prostitution in the Caribbean? there's this weird thing going on, basically. This is kind of the point of this article in some ways, is like there's this weird thing going on in the Caribbean where there's sort of like massive prostitution, both male and female prostitutes, right? Where you have like whole sex resorts and sex vacations sort of like lined up around it. So that's kind of the world. And getting into like the women that, in particular, that work in here, they're trying usually to take care of their families. And what's their hope? And you kind of got into this, that they're gonna what? Yeah, get married and essentially that somebody who's coming there from, you know, Europe or North America is gonna marry them, and that's essentially gonna pull them out of their poverty. Doesn't ever happen usually. No, and in fact, like usually people end up getting pregnant, getting STDs, things like that from serving as sex workers as opposed to actually improving their life. It, you know, at best ends up basically being the same, at worst makes their living situation worse than it was before. So despite the fact that people generally do it to improve their lives. Okay, that was a good start, yeah. Other things people want to talk about. I'll pull something out if no one else wants to. So I'm looking at page 249 at the very end here. There's this section talking about globalization and in the sex trade that starts on page 249 through 250. First of all, do you guys know what globalization refers to? What's globalization? I saw a couple of nods off this direction. Or somebody else can jump in if they want to.
Like the expansion of trade and human movement to connect the world instead of just your local area.
Yeah, so it's the idea that, so globalization is kind of the idea that people, things, ideas, you know, culture, communications, they all have it's all gotten easier to move from one location to another, right? So, you know, if you want to go to, you know, halfway across the world, all you have to do is get on a plane and go there, right? So how has globalization altered sex work? How is that changing sex work? How is that changing prostitution? Who does it bring closer together? In essence, what it's going to say is it's saying that it brings together people who essentially poorer nations and wealthier nations so that it heightens this sort of existing sex trade, right? So essentially facilitates this system where people come from Europe and they go to the Caribbean to buy prostitutes because they're cheap, right? First of all, like, just to get an idea of like the ramifications, does anybody know what prostitution's like in Europe? How difficult is it to engage in sex for money in Europe? This is a little. Have you ever been to Europe? Where'd you go in Europe?
I studied abroad in Italy.
In Italy? I don't know the prostitution laws in Italy. Did you get any
I
inkling
never
of this?
really looked into that.
You never looked into it? Well, you see, my experience, and I've talked about this before, I didn't look into it either. I mean, a little bit because I'm a sociologist and I'm fascinated by things. So, sociology, I mean, it's the same thing with like, you know, sociology as well as like criminology, right? Like, you're interested in dark and mysterious things that nobody wants to talk about, right? So like, so when I was in Germany, like, you couldn't, unless you didn't speak German, right? Because it wasn't very obvious if you didn't speak German, but like, basically every train station, there's the part of town right next to the train station is a red light district. So like, you step off and immediately, like, you see gambling centers and brothels everywhere you go, right? So we're not talking about a population that like, it's not necessarily hard for them to get prostitutes, but prostitutes in Germany are probably expensive, right? It's very different than the experience you could have going to, right, someplace that's poorer, someplace particularly in the Caribbean in this case, and being able to exchange in, right, sex for money there. So people basically come and they just have this sort of like wild experience in the Caribbean of sort of like just basically this all-inclusive resort where they just kind of like have sex with people all the time, right? So this is, it's pointing out that this is a particular phenomenon because of globalization, but it's also tied in with something older. Often throughout like history, there's been this weird relationship that other places, and we talked about this a little bit with race, right, earlier in Collins, but in more of a United States context. What was the thing that we talked about blackness? There was a term we used, black sexuality. Do you remember this section, this chapter on black sexuality in Collins? Right? Collins' big focus was images of black men versus images of black women. You guys remember this? What was the term that people used, or how did people view black male sexuality in particular? How did they view it?
Hypersexual?
Yeah, the hypersexuality thing, right? So like, there's this weird combination of, and on the other end, who's supposed to be more attractive culturally speaking? Like, who are supposed to be the most attractive visually population? So like, whiteness is held as like as a prestigious place in terms of attractiveness, but blackness is seen as being more sexual. So there's a weird tension in the culture, right? This actually is something that was common across the colonies, right? So there's this weird relationship between other places and how people viewed them sexually, as well as how engaged people were. So does anybody know anything about European sexuality in the 19th century? This is Victorian sexuality. Do people know anything about Victorian sexuality? Anybody hear anything about this before? How open were people about sex in the late 1800s? Mid to late 1800s, do you think? What did people dress like? Let's start there. In Europe, in North America, in the late 1800s.
Conservatively?
Yeah. Does anybody know what women's dresses had to, how far down they had to go dress-wise or sleeve length-wise? Yeah, it was considered improper to have anything above your ankles or above your wrist exposed, right? So you're talking about like Victorian sexuality was very much so rigid, right? So at the same time you have these myths of other places being hypersexual, which means that when people, particularly like soldiers or so on and so forth, would go off into the colonies, they would often basically view this as a location, right? Where they could get away with anything, where they could do whatever they want. And it's true, like people regularly engaged. Later in this chapter, or later in this article, it talks about like homosexuality and people going over to the Caribbean to engage in homosexual acts as well, homosexual sex. Like that has a long history of people using the colonies this way, right? So in one way, it's gotten heightened in our own culture because of globalization, right? Our own time. right? It's also this weird continuity of this colonial mythology, right? That people would go out and essentially, like, these places are wild, and the people there enjoying it. Did anybody catch that the prostitutes in the Caribbean enjoy having sex with their male or female counterparts who purchase them? Is this considered like an enjoyable occupation? Would you normally consider prostitution an enjoyable occupation? No, and they don't either, right? But the myth of hypersexuality turns it into this like, well, they want to do that. It's this pleasant thing for them, right? So like, rather than seeing it as being reliant on global inequalities, right? Okay, we're out of time. We're going to continue talking about this a little more. Particularly, I want to talk about structural adjustment policies. Did we talk about structural adjustment before in here? Somebody make a note in their notes. We're going to talk about structural adjustment when we get back. It's something really important for understanding global inequality today. Have a good day.